One of the things having been handed this sort of frame of first respondents, it was interesting that we all kind of stepped into a questioning mode around that idea of artists as first respondents in different ways, including, I guess, maybe a background question here is this presumed newness of a sort of informal capacity that the web, and the digital platforms that we're now all talking about presented is in that kind of informality that is new and has presented a new landscape. Has it been entirely co-opted by this sort of promotion of the personal and the preference? And in that regard, has that not created a kind of first responsiveness that actually is occupying a lot of space in terms of digital platforms? And if we're not talking about first respondents in regards to artists, maybe we can just say, is this a counter kind of responsiveness that we're talking about? So for Marissa, in your work, you talked about slowing down actually the pace of creative time reports.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what we discovered was that it didn't make sense for us to have artists responding to the news cycle, which is just accelerating almost, it feels like constantly. Because, I mean, I think we wanted to give them the space to reflect, and also if we wanted to sort of upend traditional takes of the news, that takes some thought, and it's not something that we felt was really working to have somebody hear about something and then respond to it right away. We just didn't feel that the artists we were working with, that their practice really worked in such a way. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, we felt that if this site was going to actually be different or have something else to say, that it was about giving space and giving more time, and allowing artists to work in a way that I think they more traditionally work, rather than asking them to be journalists.
And in the case of Trevor's work, but also James, your work, this effort to make, in a sense, the invisible visible, actually is in general takes a sort of amount of research and development before the project is even shared.
Yeah, but I mean, I hope all artists do some kind of research or have some kind of background to what they're doing. I think I really liked Dan's point that the first response is not necessarily the thing, but I think the more interesting thing that a lot of this stuff circles around is there a response at all? We can agree that we're not necessarily should not be the first people on the scene. We will get in the way, but we should definitely be there. And the thing that for me the technology enables, occasionally demands, sometimes makes difficult or makes bad, there's a better way of putting that, is that there is a kind of necessity of response, or it just is very hard not to. And also the fact that you are responding is always kind of visible, because of the ways in which that work is then disseminated and displayed and so on and so forth. So I think it's less possible to just put a thing away in a gallery and just go, no, this is just my little response over here and you don't have to worry about it. It's going to be out there and it's going to be kind of evolved. So there's always going to be a kind of context or conversation of response around it in some form.
I just also wanted to ask you, Claire, when you talked about radical the discontinuities of science fiction in some ways softening the sort of maybe rhetorical onslaught of the future, that science fiction in a sense makes the future more porous through its embrace of radical discontinuities.
I think it also prepares us for the future, which is kind of the tangled hierarchy that science fiction has, where did we land on the moon because a generation of engineers read Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, or did we land on the moon because people, it's like and do we have these glamorous these cyber hacker cabals that are taking over the world that have more power than governments because a bunch of kids were reading William Gibson and Bruce Sterling when they were teenagers? it's difficult to know what is predictive and what isn't about science fiction. But one thing that's true about it is that if we can become familiar with new scenarios ahead of time, we can be prepared for them, and we'll have time to think about them, so that when the time comes, we can have a good first response. I think is, it helps us to sort of prepare and steep ourselves in kind of the rhetoric of tomorrow.
And just, Dan, I mean, you were quite blatant in saying that in your view, perhaps artists are second, third, and beyond respondents, that there's a sort of a need to that perhaps there's a delay inherent in, to some degree, in artistic practice. Viktor Shklovsky, the Russian critic, 100 years ago said that art was, as a device, elongates attention. It actually complicates and gives a sort of demand of the shape of attention, and that perhaps that quality is a question: how does that exist in the digital shift, or in the digital predominance of communication, transactional surveillance, the atomization of transactional surveillance? How do you maintain, in a sense, that notion of art as a device?
For slowing things down?
Yeah.
Well, it's a question of choice, isn't it, partly? It's a choice of attention, choice of where you put things. You don't, as I said, I mean, James is right to say that what by and large, what we do now will be made visible at a certain point. But you still have you can still go and live, in a wood somewhere. You can go and not document what you're doing in the studio. You can have a studio in the middle of a great big city and not take a single photograph of what goes on in there. So there are still certain choices about kind of, when you put something out into the world and how long you take to incubate it and who you talk about it with. You can have private conversations with people still. But again, it's like James said, there is this sort of demand to respond that various kind of digital platforms kind of make us feel very, very anxious about. We kind of anxiously have to sort of, somehow demonstrate that we were there, that we were there thinking and having a response that was, fully formed and well considered right there in the moment. And I think we need to sort of get away from that. But there is still a choice in that. So
do you think? In Duchamp, for instance, when he had adopted the ready-made, he said it was in order to move away from the proliferation of the retinal and from the self into something that actually had to be, to some degree, guessed at or doubted in a way, and that he saw more agency, again, roughly 100 years ago in that. Do you think in your work, in engaging in kinds of with both making visible and making invisible of really, in the end, borders and that are based in legal transaction, do you think that by surfacing that, it's a move away from, in a sense, the expectations of you as an individual artist that has an individual studio practice?
I don't know about to the extent that this is all just my opinions. I think that in my work, it's I'm putting this out as an individual, but I have an expectation that it will naturally travel and be seen and explored in different ways, because that is the nature of the medium in which I work. It's not a broad brush stroke about artist practice in general at all, but it is to me fascinating and brilliant that I know that these things can be sent out, and also and always have been, in terms of the fact that people have their own encounters with the work. Anyway, I don't really see that something's kind of particularly changed in there. Though I do think there's, the lesson of Duchamp's ready-made still doesn't seem to have percolated into most stuff to any degree. That so many of the attitudes that was set up to promote are still not being addressed, or aren't particularly widely considered when talking about this stuff. Except that, again, as I sort of keep saying, they're getting harder and harder to ignore. Right? That we have actually built an entire system to make us all enforced creators of ready-mades in every way. That's what the system does. It's an incredibly perfect Duchampian system, because it's just what was demanded, and he was a science fiction writer who saw that coming first.
I was also struck in thinking through Tanya Bruguera's work, Tatlin's Whisper, which was most recently attempted to be instantiated as Yo También Exijo in Havana. That what was interesting as well in a work that is seen as timely, topical, respondent, correspondent almost. I'm curious your take on this in particular, Marissa. Just that piece is called Tatlin's Whisper number 6. So it's actually informed by a series of kind of choreographed performances of resistance and the space of resistance that actually goes back a number of years. And what's interesting to think about that is that the logic of that, so to speak, the artistic logic of that is perhaps less of interest in the coverage of her being detained than it is the fact of her being detained. Do you find that the logic, for instance, of a work like that and its sort of sequence and its terms, so to speak, comes across in the topicality of coverage around it, the reception of it?
I don't really know. No, I don't think so. I mean, it wasn't really, in terms of, you mean the press coverage that of what happened to her? No, it didn't seem so to me, really. The project itself. I mean, did you? I mean, when you were.
Well, no, I was just curious.
Yeah, no,
in my view, no.
No.
Basically, what's in the news, is the topicality of an artist being detained in
Right.
Havana.
Yeah.
And it often goes not far beyond that into
Yeah.
what the kind of concentric implications are of the work that led her to make that decision to do it there. And similarly, what it might have meant that by doing it as an artist born there but from elsewhere, what did it mean for artists that are living in Cuba and do have a different sense of the limitations or constrictions upon expression there? A lot of that, Coco Fusco kind of surfaced it to some degree in a piece that Eflux published, but it actually, I bring it up because the topicality of it, the first respondent nature of it, is perhaps simply the anecdote of the artist being detained.
Well, that's about the sort of demand for story, isn't it? You know, that's what news demands. News demands a narrative and a story. It doesn't demand what's going to be headline news is not the critical thinking behind the making of a piece of art. You know, and a really, really crass example of this would be the way art gets written about in terms of auction prices. You know, a post-impressionist painting of some flowers, that people aren't really interested in what led those flowers to be painted by that artist. That's not a news story. What's a news story is the incredibly wealthy Russian oligarch who's laid, $4 million on it. That's partly a demand of the way we demand narratives now, isn't it?
It's how it's a lot of times how we commission too, is anticipating what's going to be in the news and thinking about who are the artists who are going to say something about it and have something insightful to say about it. So, for instance, the Kenya piece that I showed you, we worked on that for 6 months before. And actually, what happened was I arrived, maybe it was even longer than 6 months, because I got to Nairobi. I met the author, Ngwatila Mayu, and knew, because in 2012 everybody was talking about the 2013 elections, they were quite fearful of what would happen. So I knew that this was going to be something that was going to be in the news, and commissioned her almost immediately after meeting her and reading her work to write something. Because I knew what she was going to say was going to be very different from the traditional news take on the Kenyan elections. But also I knew that her piece would probably get news coverage too. And overall, I mean, that's the big goal of what we're doing, is inserting these artists' voices into the news. And with Tanya, with everything that was happening with Cuba, it was sort of like a perfect storm. It all, you kind of erupted, right? But I mean, that's very much how I work. I mean, of course I really make a special effort to get to know an artist's work, but I will equally look at what's happening in the news to make sure that I'm doing something that people are going to be paying attention to. It's of the utmost importance to us.
Yeah, if you're going to commission this kind of thing, I think there's some parallels between what we do, because you have to look into the future to a certain extent.
Oh,
You have to
yeah.
look for anniversaries or pegs of some kind,
Yep.
even if it's something as stupid as Valentine's Day or something that you know people are going to be talking about. A lot of that comes down to traffic too. It's like we know that on every holiday there's going to be a flurry of posts on the subject around that holiday and different reactions to it. And it's not like artists are just wandering into the line of fire without any information. I mean, when you're doing these kinds of commissions, you have to be working with someone, or you have to look for someone who's already interested in this subject and ask them, because they're the ones that are kind of, they're the last responders. They like have been there all along. I think that's who you need to talk to.
Also, we can't get an editor usually to pay attention to us at these bigger publications unless we kind of anticipate what might be on their radar too. So that's really important for us.
Yeah, I mean, one of the,
No, I was going to say, but there's a more subtle thing you do as well in terms of particularly in terms of those Trevor Pegland photos, which for me are the kind of answer to the difficulty that was being briefly discussed a couple of times of this material, I'll see the internet question of like, what does it mean just to point it and show it, is that those photos got like reinserted into the media in a very different way. That didn't relied on a certain news qualityness of the kind of NSA revelations and that kind of stuff, but they used licensing as their major kind of tool for doing it. And I think they're such a fantastic example of like instrumentalizing the art in a certain way in order to kind of sneak it in there and turn, what could just be an image on a wall or a thing into like something far, far more active and scripted that goes out into the world. That isn't just writing a news story, but is actually something far more nuanced and targeted.
Claire, in your work, you've talked about how there's being both like a musician and a writer and an editor, the difference between a sort of expected immediacy around the live performance and providing the universality of music as a sort of immediacy, which I only bring because it's like when you go to a show, you're expecting the artist as first respondent, the artist as someone who's taking on immediacy, but you've distinguished that from the work of not only the editing, but the delay of science fiction, the kind of, again, I'm using that word delay, but the implicit delay of science fiction that allows for a different critical space. Can you talk about that just?
Well, I think that in this moment in time, all artists are existing on like 3 or 4 different temporal tracks. As a musician, there's a part of my livelihood that requires being in a place with people in a moment, and there is an ephemeral quality to music that is, rooted in time. But at the same time, a musician must use the same tools that we use to make music to disseminate and communicate with people, and that happens in a much more diffuse way. A writer, you write in the moment and then you publish something and you seem to have like a 48-hour window in which anyone can give a shit about it, and then it's over, especially when you're talking about like a hot take or something on something topical. But it continues to live, it's not just that window of time. If something is on the internet and it's in a place which maybe is not going to go out of business anytime soon, or you have an archive of it online, then people can continue to react to it for years. I mean, the longer you write on the web, the more you get emails from people from like 6 years ago who read something that you wrote. I get comments on a blog that I haven't updated in 3 years because everything is existing in this sort of simultaneous, equivalence.
You think 48 hours? I think that's really generous, but yeah.
I guess it depends, if you're West Coast or East Coast too.
I really noticed that as an editor of a magazine that, I suppose to use Christopher Knight's phrase from yesterday, is in a way part of like the niche art legacy publishing. It's a glossy print magazine. It's been going for 25 years, but at the same time, it's a magazine that has, now we have we have blogs, we have social media, we make videos. We produce at different kind of temporal rates. But one thing I've always noticed about doing a magazine and the print magazine is how it's consumed at different kind of paces. And you get diehard fans who might like kind of get a issue through the mail, for subscribers, and they'll read it cover to cover and provide some kind of response. But most people don't. It's not the way I consume magazines. The way I consume magazines is bit by bit and slowly, and that could be like a copy of the New Yorker that's next to the Loo, which, you kind of read slowly over the course of many visits, or, Or it's something, that you stumble across years later in a magazine. You know, you might be like Ben yesterday in his lecture was talking about going to the library and looking at Art Forum in 1982 or whatever, and discovering new things. Publishing has its sort of slowness, and some things that are very, very old can suddenly seem very, very fresh again. You know, things that were overlooked at the time can suddenly seem like very, very urgent. So they kind of renew themselves.
Do you think, given that, that there is a role though for, I mean, Paul's project with op-eds, has invited, like Dred Scott was responding to Ferguson's, or events like Ferguson, really larger implications than just Ferguson, kind of in the moment, but from perhaps his ongoing engagement as an artist. Similarly, I thought anyway, Coco Fusco's entry into Joe Scanlon's practice was really helpful and was performed a kind of like mediating in-betweenness that allowed people to have a more sophisticated conversation about the reception of that via the Whitney Biennial. Do you think, I guess I'm asking, in your role, do you think that is something that Freeze, for instance, finds new platforms for, or new immediacy for, or in terms of like providing that space for a kind of highly editorialized immediate
I think we'd like, I think we'd like to do more of that. I mean, we've been working with a slightly antiquated website for the last few years, which has not allowed us to maybe be as dynamic as we could. But I think that, I think like different rates of response are really kind of valuable in editorial work. I think there's, responding very, very quickly to something as it happens can be really important. I think you have the example of like the controversy around the Joe Scanlon work at the Whitney Biennial, and then Coco Fusco's response to that, and the whole conversation around that was something that has to kind of happen in the moment. Whereas it's still possible, though, to have that conversation 6 months later, because these problems don't go away either. I think that's an important thing. A slow response is also a reminder that problems of, for instance, race in the art world don't disappear because people stop talking about them in the kind of buzzy world of social media, or kind of what gets circulated very, very rapidly online. And I think that in a weird sort of way, like what's printed on paper and like the slowness of distribution with that kind of provides some sort of not just sort of archiving, not just sort of archiving role, but also it provides provides a break, as in like a car brake. It slows things down.
Can I just mess up that question a little bit though, by saying that like these aren't slow responses. No, like a fast response is not necessarily purely a fast response. Particularly, I think in case of the creative time or the op-eds things, like because you're asking people who've been thinking about this for quite a while, right? And actually their response may be a lot more kind of thoughtful and in depth than a lot of the kind of immediate media responses of stuff. I mean, that is the thing about going out and asking different people who have worked on something for quite a long time, is that you're drawing on a huge extensive body of knowledge that a very fast-moving media wasn't. And that just because it's published close to the event doesn't mean it's not actually based on a kind of long and deep history and engagement.
That's a good point.
Also, just to add to that, one of the beautiful things that about, I think, asking an artist to respond, versus a journalist, because as working as a journalist for so many years, there's all these rules that you have to abide by, and you have to work in a certain way. Whereas the artist can draw on so many different sources, work in so many different ways, embed themselves in communities, and don't have the rules that a journalist might. And that, I think, then produces also something that can be very different. And
I think that also brings up this distinction between the arts journalist and the arts writer. There are very different types of writing about art. There's writing about who's moving where in the institutions, or like what things are being sold for, or what's kind of very newsy or very sort of fact-based and requires journalistic skills, proper professional journalistic skills. But then writing a monographic essay about an artist's work or an historical movement or something requires other skills. That requires skills to do with imagination and empathy and maybe deep sort of historical knowledge or having followed someone for a long time. Maybe it requires sort of different kinds of literary skills. And so, you know, when we think about this idea of like first response, and this sort of circles back to what we were just saying just now, it's about like, what are who has the best set of tools for a given situation? There isn't a one size sort of fits all kind of solution to this.
Right. And that was kind of, I think this was a Twitter question, how do artists respond differently from critics and journalists, which I think you were just sort of getting at. But is there, I mean, is there, in a sense, do you feel like you're creating space through your projects? In this case, I would say this to Claire, Marissa, and Dan as editors. You know, are you creating platforms that you see as being sustainable in that way, that can actually, and if you are, what are those? How do you differentiate those from? How do you differentiate the time registers of your responsibility as an editor and publisher that invites artists into a particular format?
Wait, define sustainable?
Yeah,
sustainable as sustainable meaning something you think will, like you said, stick around, be there for a period of time, not just disappear.
Well, I mean, I think working on the internet, you always have to keep in the back of your mind the possibility that, you know, the platform will someday disappear, and reconcile yourself to that, and try to sort of live it up while you still can. That's always been my attitude. It's like,
But like, I mean, but different to book publishing or magazine publishing,
Yes.
previously, how, just on a shorter scale.
sure, of course. I mean, we're talking about slow and fast, but really these are all kind of condensed timescales. Really, I mean, we're talking about like years at the most, and you know, the world is vast and time is vast, and even our books will one day turn to dust. So we have to just reconcile ourselves to that to a certain extent, and try to just make work that lasts. I think with in people that affects people.
Yeah, I think there's something there about this, but just the quality of the work.
Yeah.
Just like all the stuff I had to timeframes and the fast and slow responses. It's ultimately about getting people to make work and getting it out there, and the response, like maybe that's the difference between the artist and the critic, or there are shades towards it. But ultimately, is that you just want to get the thing out there and say the thing, and then then all those other processes can happen to it.
I'm not sure. Hopefully, this is part of this. But our platform is interesting because it's whether or not people come to our site, we'd absolutely love lots of visitors to our site, and it's great. But like what we really aim for, it's not emphasizing the platform as much as it's the insertion. Mm-hmm. And that's been a really interesting thing to try to work with, because with the emphasis of numbers and metrics and look Google Analytics and how are we doing and all of these things, and then what happens when you kind of take the ProPublica model, which is which is also just like us inserting into mainstream newspapers. What does that mean for you and the system? Where will we be? We may not be around, but these pieces will still live on in these other sites. Let's say and that's something that has been part of our process of realizing that if the goal is that artists are being read and discussed by people all over the world, how are we best going to serve that? And that was a really conscious decision at the very beginning for us.
And it was interesting to hear that it was really slowing down and taking the time to think of maybe more strategically about the insertion of the work or the artist into a different level of circulation and distribution that created an efficacy that otherwise you wouldn't have had. But do you feel as though you're influenced by your partners in that regard?
Our partners want the people that often they haven't ever heard of, or are doing things that are really interesting that are not on their radar. So in order, I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but when we think about our partners, we think about what can we bring them that they aren't going to be able to do themselves. Mm-hmm. And having creative time and a knowledge of the art world and artists, we really bring something to them that otherwise I don't know they would be able to they've ever even heard of. Or so I mean that's how we try to think. We try to think of how can we sort of help grow or expand the kinds of pieces that they are putting out into the world. That's where we see our role.
I mean, just speaking about our work on Freeze magazine, a couple of years ago we started making our own short videos, which is something you see a lot of bigger news organisations doing, but not so much in the kind of sphere of like specialist art magazines. And they're just like short 10-minute films that we do with a production company in London, and they're all paid for out of the editorial budget of the magazine. But it's been very much like a kind of learning as we go process, making these things. But what we've discovered is that it's opened up a new sort of function of the magazine for us, which is possibly one of record and one of like a possible kind of like archival value, which print doesn't really sort of do in the same way. So for instance, when was it, last year? I think it was last year, we produced our first 30-minute documentary, which we did in association with the BBC, which is about the history of the Glasgow art scene. And through the magazine, through the kind of contacts we have, we were able to speak to a whole range of different people from different generations in Glasgow about the history of what, how the arts have developed in the city. We were lucky enough to be able to use the BBC's archive to pull in sort of bits of archive footage. But we also, and this is a sort of terrible accident of history, we also ended up being one of the last people to photograph the inside of the Glasgow School of Art before it was hit by a fire. So what this documentary ends up being is this sort of snapshot of Glasgow at a certain moment before something happened, which was sort of very, sort of symbolic to the city. And now we have, this great sort of 30-minute record of lots of different people of different generations speaking about their connection to the city. And it operates in a different way to something in print, because we don't have an editorialized voice. I mean, of course, we make editing decisions in, what you show, but it's talking heads, basically. It's artists and curators and writers talking straight to camera, and you can hear the grain of their voice, see what they're like. You can kind of see their environment. And I think that's something that technology's allowed us to do as a magazine, or to start exploring as a magazine.
But so, I mean, that's also partly why even just the commissions, the Walker commissions, inviting artists to make works that respond to signature artists in our collection, but that already have an interest in, say, Derek Jarman in the case of Moira Davey and James Richards, was the interest in surfacing a new platform that could invite that kind of expertise, that kind of ongoing, say, engagement, the allure of something that already has a momentum. Do you think that the success of something like that would lead the magazine to devoting more time and space and resources to that? And what's the balance with sort of exploring perhaps really meaningful new platforms for artists, and then, but at the same time providing, as you put it, a kind of legacy role of or not legacy, but a kind of convention of reception that is still valuable because it has a inherent slowness or convention.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are questions of just economics. We don't. These videos are produced out of the editorial budget, and we don't have like extra money for them that is raised by any like sponsorship or advertising of these videos, and we're able to produce them because the production company we work with are friends of ours, and we get a kind of mates rates basically on their facilities. But I think what's interesting for us as a magazine is how it has raised this this question of like horses for courses. Kind of what are the right writing skills for a certain type of platform or situation. So the writing skills that you need to write a 400-word review are different to the writing skills you need to write a 2,500-word monographic essay about, an important historical artist, which in turn are very different to the kind of writing skills you need to write for the moving image, which requires more concision. It requires more sensitivity to speech rather than to words on a page. So I think that's another kind. It's another kind of writing. It's another kind of writing that we're learning about.
But isn't the acuity of new forms of writing and responsive to this kind of immediate attention? And I mean, we're describing things that don't sound that different than they have been in terms of approaches. So I mean, I guess I'm asking, is there a new kind of artist that is a first responder that's adopting, in a sense, this the acuity of a kind of immediate response? That, because I feel like we're sort of talking about the counter to that.
I just want to say that I keep want to make science fiction metaphors, basically, and this is a really long one. But there's something about like the way you just talked about making that Glasgow film is that you were basically making a kind of like science fiction without knowing it, because you were predicting something into the future. Like you weren't predicting it. I hope you didn't set fire to the place. But like there's a weird kind of, there is already a thing happening in time there. That has happened, and actually. Not all artists, but a huge number. And also in terms of when you make stuff that's deliberately intended to go into news cycle and stuff, you are doing a kind of futurism and a kind of futurology that is predictive. I think the difference to that, to the kind of pure reactive hot take thing that we criticize, is that it's done from a position of kind of thoughtfulness and consideration. And so that you're coming to it with like a domain awareness and a history of research into that kind of thing that allows you, like, you know, in hindsight, to go, oh yeah, I was doing science fiction at this point because I was looking for a place in which I knew there was going to be some kind of interesting cultural activity or some kind of moment, and a moment in which you are essentially projecting yourself forward at the time that you kind of make or write this thing. And that's the same thing that happens to archive pieces that kind of get resuscitated or whatever. They all exist on those kind of timelines, and when they get reacted is essentially speaks to the kind of the quality of the thought that went into them in the first place.
I think that just artists and writers in general have always had the skill of anticipation, you know, because if you're paying attention to the world, you can kind of, this is actually a William Gibson thing, you can sort of trace the nodes of things that are latent and see where they might intersect because you're looking. And so that, I mean, is a form of looking into the future, but it's also just awareness of the present.
What Gibson does in terms of that kind of just reaching across the network and picking things out, it's like particularly, like it speaks completely to that flattening of time. Like there's no kind of temporality to the thing at all. He just has what appears to us to be a kind of temporal foresight, which is actually just a kind of spatial one because he exists in this kind of wider and more distributed network. But I think a lot of artists of a certain kind, and the ones who are being more active, that's what they're doing. They're kind of spreading out through these networks and just being slightly more aware of them.
Yeah.
Rather than being determined by them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that anticipatory predictive quality is actually pretty different in some ways than discussing it as a perhaps respondent, correspondent, embedded, reacting to the incident.
I think it relates slightly to what we were talking about last night as well, when when I complained about this label of political artist or activist artist, which is like one that I get a lot because I make work about drones and war and stuff. And like I don't object to it because it's a perfectly good label and I have a politics. But I find it weird that it's just applied to me because I'm making work about these things, as though making work about anything isn't about these things, or making work about the world in which you encounter is not like some kind of form of activism or involvement in the world. And I feel that's quite similar in terms of this thing about like, oh, you know, are you an artist who engages with this stuff or not? It's like, what do you do? We live in the world. Hi.
Yeah.
I think it might be because we have this great group of people, but also it's our last opportunity for audience questions. I thought I would open it up to the audience for any questions on our conversation or thoughts and responses.
My favorite science fiction short story is Roadside Picnic, you know, in which we as a human race are dealing with the detritus left behind by an alien invasion in which they seem to take no notice of us whatsoever. And I just wanted, instead of a question, just like sort of a comment. You know, I feel like it's relevant to this conversation in the sense that, you know, like, you know, we are grappling with our responses to these things to these technologies and to these modes of working and modes of like socializing that we still don't quite have a handle on, and yet are trying to make proclamations around and, determine our future according to, the clumsy ways in which, we're moving forward in the present moment.
Yeah. I mean, the cosmic zoom out is always really important. I mean, it's, in the midst of all of this deep conversation about essentially invisible things that matter a great deal to us, we must always remember that, we're on a rock, and that, if an alien is passing by, they don't necessarily have any understanding or interest in what we're talking about. It's useful to remember that sometimes, even if it's just like this kind of theoretical construct, like we may not be alone in the universe, and if we aren't, then, we are just as important as the other guy, and we know nothing about what's going on with them. So, yeah.
There's something in there about as well, just about the indeterminacy of our present, and like the acknowledgement of that, which I think is often possible in art and is not possible in politics. The fact that within journalism or the kind of political stuff, it's full of people going, no, I am right about this. And that is one of the major problems with the world. The refusal to kind of acknowledge a little bit of, kind of contextual difference or dissonance in that. And that's what those kind of stories teach us more and more, and that I don't think it would be impossible to spread that notion a little bit further into other forms of public discourse.
There's a sense, though, that this gets at a very important gap, which is that the politics of art, or the art that embeds critique, kind of promises a political accomplishment that it doesn't deliver, and it actually often thrives on that non-delivery, or the ambiguity that is created around not delivering, in a sense, the political agency. There's a which is very different than being in the position of political power.
Yeah, I don't, and I am afraid to, and I'm disillusioned by the inability of the kind of political forms of art or those things to, as you say, come true on a lot of the claims that they make. We haven't got that figured out yet. And yeah, if you want to do that, then you should probably retrain as a lawyer. We know that other things have bigger structural things, but at the same time, that's not the only thing we're trying to do in the world either.
Yeah, over here.
Hi, just continuing on this idea of power. In your various subjects, I feel like issues have come up, like issues of curation, issues of systemic disposition. I was just wondering what you guys had to say in terms of the role of values and the implementation of values, and who's making the decisions that sort of generate the values that result in decisions that affect all of our disciplines.
Well, that's a big question.
Sorry.
It's a very, very good question, and a big question. All I can say to that is maybe just to sort of reiterate something I was trying to sort of say earlier in my talk, which is that I think we need to not be myopic about, first within just sort of speaking about the arts generally, about what fields we work in. This idea that kind of visual artists are somehow the most interesting ones, and that people who do things in other fields, don't have political agency or what have you. I think there's a conversation we're all involved in. And then secondly, not be, I think being aware of your own sort of biases in terms of where you come from, both sort of metaphorically and literally, physically. I think it's just something you need to maintain some vigilance on, and it's not easy. It's not at all easy to do. But yeah, sorry, that's a really inarticulate answer and a very, very platitudinous one. So I apologise, but I think maintaining vigilance about those things is absolutely valuable, and not just getting locked down in the specialist conversations of your own field, about what we're doing here as professional art critics, or what we're doing here as, you know, artists who work just in the visual arts. I think not getting bogged down in your own sort of lane. I think it's crucial not to.
And being transparent too, you know. I think for most people their work speaks for whatever their values are, I think, but I think a lot of people are afraid to have an opinion about something because there's just always the possibility that you're going to get trolled for it. Which is a very real fear, and I think affects obviously some people more than others, but we shouldn't sacrifice our capacity to speak openly about what we believe in, and especially when it comes to our work.
And also that transparency, again, can work maybe both. I'm just saying everything both ways today. But in terms of like, the transparency is good because it means we are actually like being serious and genuine and saying what we're talking about and like expressing our values clearly, both through the work and what we do. It also hopefully builds some kind of solidarity with other people who may kind of share that stuff, but it also opens us up to proper critique of that stuff as well. That I want to be challenged on those values. So sometimes I get like really scared when I express like something that I feel very strongly about in my work and that like is the reason for doing it. But more often than not, like it's good that comes out because either it gets reinforced because there's that solidarity there, or because like there's genuinely good, strong kind of criticism, and I understand like the effect that this is really, really happening. So I think it's absolutely necessary to state values for both of those reasons.
So you feel like values are occurring organically out of a conversation, sort of between systemic and organic.
The values are?
Yeah.
I don't know, I think there's probably some kind of, I hope I'd subscribe to some what I would consider to be kind of universal ones, and then there's the more kind of actionable ones that happen on your encounter with stuff. But that should always be open to some kind of critique and conversation.
Yeah, otherwise it just becomes ideology, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Hi, we've spent a fair amount of time kind of bemoaning the lack of power that comes in a lot of our positions and what we're looking at. But first responders are somebody who has a lot of power, right? They often frame the narrative because they're the first draft. They often talk when the most people are listening, so that narrative is picked up by a lot of people. And so the question becomes, I guess my question is, I know it's hard to be first responders as artists, but how do we get there? What can we start doing to be in that position?
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I don't think we should shy away from actually trying to occupy that position for everything we've said. If in fact, we believe in the values essentially of those things we're trying to say. I don't have a particularly coherent strategy for doing that, except that I think actually like stating these things clearly and loudly is and remains important. That we shouldn't, while being reasonably reticent about like the actual political effect that some of this work might have, not shy away from saying that we think it should, and holding saying loudly and clearly what we think essentially. I mean, I don't necessarily do that much, and I don't right now on this stage in front of you all feel like I don't have a huge amount of power. I feel very lucky to have it, so that's when we get to say those things. How we say them more widely, a little bit harder.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there, in that like being the first person to say something is often a really scary position, because you're advancing an opinion that people haven't necessarily commented on yet, and you're opening yourself up totally for kind of being trolled or criticised or what have you, and it's a very brave position to take. And I think that if you do take that position, it's just a case of being open to the fact that you can modify your views, and the people who are listening to you make that first statement, that first kind of salvo of kind of reaction, shouldn't like take you down for that either, because it's a very you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable position, and people need to respect that vulnerability. I think. Yeah,
that idea, which is a valuable one, that the act of criticism or critique is self-education in public.
Yeah, it is,
and not, in a sense, making a judgment that is universal. It is a modified. It's a putting oneself in a position of.
And it's difficult because things last, and if you make an opening salvo in a time of crisis that turns out to be misguided, then that stays with you unless you have the capacity to go back and edit it as many times as is necessary until your opinion is like Wikipedia style, up to date. But we have to remember that we all have the right to make that opening salvo.
But also, it doesn't have to be the thing that is said first or loudest either. But it just to say the new thing as well. I think as well. There's like again that kind of slightly temporal difference of like when the thing that is said that is new that should be kind of supported and critically engaged with very carefully. That doesn't have to be the thing said first and loudest. At the same time.
And I think if you're a critic, you also have to remember that you're perfectly within your rights to change your mind. Which a lot of people don't really expect of critics. I think you're totally able to disagree with yourself, disagree with the younger version of yourself. God knows I've written some crap that I can't believe I said at the time, and I would never say now.
Yeah, but then it's kind of nice because you have a historical record of what prevailing opinions or contrarian opinions and whatever it was that you were writing, contained within your own body of work. Like you create your own history. And you can't have that record unless you take the risk of saying the thing in the first place.
Unless there's a burning last question, maybe we can end there. And thank you for the conversation.